Okay, well, we're welcoming Dr. Gordon Chang, who is author of The Coming Collapse of China. Mr. Chang, I'm wondering if you could weigh in on Chinese officials who have recently released new information about coronavirus cases in the city of Wuhan. They're showing that the death toll is actually 50% higher than previously reported. This update plays into accusations that China is downplaying the severity of its outbreak. I'm wondering if you can describe how Beijing has tried to shape the narrative about the coronavirus outbreak in the country.
Yeah, Chinese officials have tried to downplay the severity of the outbreak. And even with the adjustment upwards in death toll, I think they're still undercounting. People have been saying that there are tens of thousands of deaths in Wuhan, 40,000, 50,000. We just don't know. But the numbers that they're giving us still don't make sense. And this is consequential. And we know that because Dr. Deborah Birx, who is the White House coronavirus coordinator, actually said a couple of weeks ago that her team looked at the Chinese numbers and thought that this disease was no more serious than SARS, which is a 2002-2003 epidemic. And therefore, they did not take certain precautions. However, when they saw the virus spread through Italy and Spain, they realized that they were then mistaken, and it was the Chinese numbers that had thrown them off the trail. So this has been a response that we've heard from other officials saying that China downplayed the numbers, therefore misleading them as well. So this is serious.
And if we can't trust China, China is also denying reports that the coronavirus originated from a laboratory in Wuhan that was studying infectious diseases. The director of the lab told Chinese state media just 2 days ago that there's no way that the virus came from the lab. However, reports in the American media citing US officials suggest that the virus did come from this lab. What evidence is there that the coronavirus came from the lab in Wuhan and not the wet markets?
Yeah, there is an article in The Lancet, which is the authoritative British medical journal. It was posted January 24th, and it said that many of the initial coronavirus cases had no contact with the wet market. And that really means that the wet market could not have been the source of this, at least the initial source. The other sources, probably the P4 Wuhan Institute of Virology, that biosafety lab. So that is the prime culprit. And there's a couple of other things. We had a State Department team tour the Wuhan Institute of Virology in 2018. They came away very concerned because they saw that the safety protocols were not being followed. And that meant that, of course, you could have an outbreak. Matter of fact, that State Department team warned that there could be a pneumonia-like outbreak from this lab. So there is this, and right now we don't know, but the one thing that we do know for sure is that Beijing has really tried to prevent foreign virologists and epidemiologists from studying this outbreak, the source of it. And that's a real indication that Beijing has something to hide.
And now I was speaking to an expert today who's at the University of Houston, and he is also an expert on US and China relations. And he said that, this is not, the report that it came from a lab is not something to focus on, and that politicians should stick to politics and let the scientists figure this out. And also, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson also said this, to let scientists figure out where it originated and not to put so much weight in these conspiracy theories. I'm wondering, what's your response to that?
The most important thing is not how this got out of the lab, because I don't think it was deliberate. But we should wonder why the Chinese were studying coronaviruses in the first place. And we've got to be concerned that Beijing does have a secret biological weapons program. Both the United States and China are members of the Biological Weapons Convention, which prohibits the maintenance of bioweapons programs, but there's no inspection regime in the convention. And so I think the United States needs to insist on strict verification and inspections. Otherwise, I don't think we should be a member of this agreement. But the most important thing is how the Chinese officials dealt with this once the virus left the lab. And that leads to many dark conclusions about Chinese intentions.
And the Chinese government repeatedly criticized other countries for closing their borders in response to the pandemic. And the World Health Organization initially called on countries not to limit the travel to China. Given what we know now about how infectious the coronavirus is, the novel coronavirus, are China and the World Health Organization partially responsible for its worldwide spread?
I think that the Chinese Communist Party and the World Health Organization are totally responsible for the global pandemic. There are a couple things here. Beijing, for the first time, admitted that the coronavirus was human-to-human transmissible on January 20. But doctors in Wuhan knew this second week of December, which means Beijing knew about it just shortly thereafter. Now, if China had said nothing about this for 5.5 weeks, that would have been dangerously irresponsible. But Beijing tried to mislead the world into believing it was not H2H, human-to-human transmissible. And the World Health Organization helped them with that infamous January 14th tweet. In addition, at the same time, Chinese officials, knowing this was human-to-human transmissible, they tried to pressure countries to keep their borders open, to not impose travel restrictions and quarantines on arrivals from China. And the WHO, with its January 10th statement, backed Beijing up on that. So there's two things here. I think Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler, I don't know what was in his mind, but if having seen the devastation to China from the coronavirus, if he wanted to even the playing field by spreading the virus elsewhere, he would have done exactly what he in fact did. And that leads us to a couple conclusions which are hard to accept. And that is either China was reckless, taking actions it knew would inevitably lead to the spread of the virus, or it was in fact malicious, that it wanted this virus to spread. In either case, China's responsible. Yeah, okay, this was an accidental release from a lab. But the point is, once it was released, Beijing took actions that it knew would cause suffering and death outside China.
And so will the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese president be able to stay in power after this? Do they still have solid support at home?
There's a lot of anger in Chinese society. And we saw that after the death of one of the doctors who are in the Wuhan 8. The February 7th death of Dr. Li Wenliang just triggered anger across social media platforms. Now, there have been many times when the Chinese people have been upset at the Communist Party and the party has survived it. But now there's something different. And that is that the Chinese economy is at a standstill. They claimed in Beijing that gross domestic product for the first quarter declined only 6.8%. But it was year on year, but it was probably much more severe than that. And so you've got white hot anger and you've got an economy which is crippled. And, people in China, many people don't know what a downturn is. Matter of fact, most people don't because they haven't seen one. And so I think that essentially the party's facing a challenge right now. And by the way, because of the way that it allowed this virus to spread, I think that Beijing is not going to have the support around the world that it did in the past. Just to give you one example, right after the Tiananmen massacre in 1989, the United States imposed sanctions, but President George H.W. Bush sent his secret emissary, Brent Scowcroft, to Beijing to say, oh, don't worry about this. We don't really mean it. Don't worry about our sanctions. We've got your back. That's not going to happen this time.
And I'm wondering, how will global relationships with China change as a result of the pandemic? What is your prediction for US-China relationships, but also for countries who were very hard hit by the virus, especially due to their links with China, whether it's Iran or Italy? I'm wondering, how do you think those relationships will change?
Well, regimes like Iran and North Korea, for instance, that are dependent on China, they probably are not going to change their relationships that much. Leaders are going to be upset, but that probably won't have an effect on policy. But when it comes to the Western democracies, when it comes to Japan, countries in the region, I think that Beijing has lost support, and it's going to be very difficult for China to get beyond that. China's regime needs support from the outside world. It still has an export-dependent economy. It needs open access to the American and European markets, among others. I think it's going to be very hard for that, for Beijing to maintain that, because as people study the outbreak, they will more and more realize that this spread was unnecessary. This just should have been a local epidemic in the center of China. Instead, it has killed hundreds of thousands, and it sickened millions. And this is not over yet. So I think Beijing is going to face real changes in the way, there'll be real changes in the way that other governments interact with Beijing.
And now the US is the single largest funder of the World Health Organization, but US President Trump froze US funding for the WHO pending an investigation into the organization's handling of the coronavirus pandemic. Trump has said that the WHO promoted disinformation from China, and you have also said that China intimidated the WHO in this scenario. How did Beijing influence the WHO?
Well, Beijing spent a lot of effort in getting the current Director General, Dr. Tedros, elected. And Tedros was a leftist anyway, who would maybe normally support China. But certainly that is, I think, a factor. But when you think about this, China maybe puts $40 million a year into the WHO, which is a tenth of what the U.S. government does. And then you got to consider also that it's not just the U.S. government. You've got Bill Gates's foundation. So Americans put a lot of money in the WHO, but get very little out of it. There's just got to be a reassessment. The WHO has a lot of great doctors and professionals who do really important work, but that work is nullified by this senior leadership of the organization. And we know that going back about a week and a half, a senior WHO doctor, Maria von Kerkhove, gave a press briefing in which she said she knew that this was H to H almost immediately from the get-go. She knew it because she was a MERS specialist, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, another coronavirus. And yet she said that her concerns were disregarded by the senior leadership of the WHO. So it doesn't matter whether you got a lot of great doctors there. It's just this is Beijing's determining a political line. WHO supported China in keeping borders open, supported China's narrative that this was not human-to-human transmissible. There's got to be a reassessment of the international community, because the WHO in its present configuration is promoting disease. It's not hindering it.
Now, last question. I'm wondering your thoughts specifically on US-China relations going forward. There was this trade deal that was signed in January. Is that going to be still a possibility? What do you think will be the relationship between the two presidents? Also, President Trump has spoken out against the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson, saying that this virus came from American soldiers. So there's been tension amid this pandemic. But I'm wondering, what are your predictions for the future of US-China relations?
Well, ties are going to get tense. They're going to get tense because, as we talked about, we're going to learn more about what China did to spread this disease. There's, at this moment, 39,000 Americans have died. Those people died only because China spread this disease. And that's got to have severe implications for the relationship going forward. And indeed, it should. You know, we Americans really don't pay much attention to the propaganda from other countries. We just ignore it. We've got a legitimate political system, so propaganda is not that important to us. But for China, it is. And last May, People's Daily, which is the most authoritative publication in China, carried a piece which declared a quote unquote people's war on the US. Now, we may think that that is absurd and ludicrous, but it's not. And we Americans have paid with many lives when we've ignored what our adversaries have said. We're heading into an election in November. Both candidates are going to, I think, have to show that they can defend the US against the militant and hostile Chinese regime. And so, and I think that it's not just going to be campaign rhetoric. This is going to determine the way the American people and the way the American political establishment deals with China going forward. It's going to be a very different relationship. It's not going to be friendly. It's not going to be supportive. It's going to be tense.
Well, Gordon Chang, thank you so much for answering all of these questions and providing your insight. It's definitely very interesting to hear your point of view.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you.
Mhm.